As far as we know, Gregg Lee was born and raised in Possum Springs, but the most influential moment of his young life took place on a farm out past Brittle. Gregg was 8 years old at the time, and his parents had sent him there to live with his uncle for a month. Gregg's uncle owned a sheep farm, so Gregg spent his time following his uncle around and learning to care for the animals. One afternoon, as the summer sun descended above the farm, Gregg's uncle left him alone by the sheep pen. And simply because he was a young, foolish child, Gregg decided to open the gate. The sheep ran to the nearby highway, where 4 were killed by a semi-truck. 3 crossed the median and made it to the other side. There, they stopped, and for a moment, Gregg and the surviving sheep stared at each other, both parties unsure of what to do. Gregg waved his arms at them, and though 2 did come rushing back to him, unfortunately, they were hit by a truck. But the last sheep made a different decision. It turned away from Gregg and ran off into the woods, never to be seen again. Years later, Gregg would get a tattoo of a single sheep on his bicep in memory of the brave little animal. For him, that sheep had become a symbol of the kind of person he wanted to become. A person who got away from the proverbial pen keeping him confined. A person who got away from Possum Springs. A person who died anywhere else. Little is known about Gregg's early life aside from the incident at the sheep farm, but it still tells us a great deal about his family. According to Gregg, his parents sent him to live with his uncle because they got tired of him. That's a horrible thing to do to an 8-year-old, and thus it goes without saying that Gregg's parents aren't very good people, and are like so many other authority figures in Possum Springs. Unkind and uncaring. Sadly, I think it's likely that the reason his parents got tired of him was his neurodivergence. B speculates that Gregg has bipolar disorder, and I suspect she's right about this. If so, it's possible that Gregg struggled with mood swings throughout his life, even when he was a child. Neurodivergence isn't well understood here in 2025, and it certainly wasn't in the early 2000s when Gregg was growing up, and there are many who still believe that hard work and discipline can fix something like bipolar disorder. So I wouldn't be surprised if this is why his parents got tired of him and sent him to live with his uncle. They didn't know how to respond to his bipolar disorder, and thought sending him to work on a farm would improve his manic and depressive tendencies. Talk to anyone who grew up in Pennsylvania, and they'll probably tell you that being sent to live on a farm is a common threat we hear from our parents, usually in jest. Gregg's just happened to be serious about it. Aside from his parents and his uncle, Gregg does have 2 other family members worth mentioning. The first is his cousin Jaen, who Mae can find shooting her crossbow out past Bruce's camp on day 9. She only shows up once, and only in the Weird Autumn edition, so if you missed her, that's probably why. Still, in her brief appearance, she conveys some interesting information. Jaen says she's in town to pick up a few things from Gregg's mother, and tells Mae to tell Gregg to come visit her in Bright Harbor again sometime. Jaen goes to college out there, where she's studying fashion design. And as we'll later learn, Gregg and Angus plan on relocating to Bright Harbor once they can scrounge up the funds to move there. Their decision to do so was inspired by a trip they took to Bright Harbor before the events of the game. When you combine this with Jaen's dialogue, I suspect that during that trip, they stayed with her. Jaen's presence in Bright Harbor, I'd argue, will make their entire plan more viable. They'll have her to rely on as they get their feet under them. They won't have to do it all on their own. She can show them around town, introduce them to people she knows, and they might even be able to crash at her place if necessary. Before we move on, there are 2 more things about Jaen that stand out to me. The first is that, as mentioned earlier, when Mae finds her, she's shooting a crossbow, just like Gregg does in his 3rd hangout. This, plus Gregg's dialogue in that hangout, seems to imply that their family is fond of hunting. It makes sense when you think about it. Gregg is a fox, after all, and foxes are excellent hunters, but it's also reflective of the regional culture. In some parts of western Pennsylvania, where Night in the Woods is set, November 1st, the day after Halloween, is a holiday because it's the start of hunting season. As a teacher myself, I think the day after Halloween should always be a day off, at least for students, but I digress. The second topic I'd like to bring up in regards to Jaen is her relationship with Gregg's mother. If she's come to Possum Springs to pick up something from Gregg's mother before she heads back to college, this implies that his mother must not be a completely terrible person, despite her awful decision to send him away to live with his uncle on the sheep farm. And while we're on the subject of his uncle, it's possible that Jaen is the daughter of the same uncle that owned the sheep farm, but personally, I doubt it. I get the impression that Gregg's uncle had no children, at least at the time, which is why having Gregg around for the summer was supposed to have been a helpful thing for him. Furthermore, if Jaen was his daughter, then I'd imagine she would have been around for the incident with the sheep. but Gregg doesn't mention her in his story, and thus I'm inclined to believe that she comes from a different side of the family. Another member of Gregg's family who we hear about in-game is his great-great-grandfather, who served in World War I. Interestingly enough, there's something of a discrepancy here, at least there seems to be to me, anyway, in terms of which side his great-great-grandfather actually fought for. All this stems from conflicting information about a helmet that his great-great-grandfather either wore or brought back home as a souvenir. The helmet, specifically, is a Prussian Pickelhaube, or pickle helmet, which was worn by Prussian and German soldiers during World War I. Gregg has added an anarchy symbol to it, and it has a bullet hole in the front. In the first conversation between Gregg and Mae about the helmet, Gregg states that his great-great-grandfather was wearing it when he was shot in the head, hence the hole, and that he survived because it didn't hit any important parts of the brain, as if there were such a thing as unimportant parts of the brain, and because his great-great-grandfather was tough as nails. This would indicate that Gregg's great-great-grandfather served in the Prussian military during the First World War. However, later on, after he and Mae have acquired the car battery, they have a second conversation about the helmet. Here, Gregg draws attention to the bullet hole and says, quote, "Whoever was wearing it is dead now," which implies that he doesn't know who the helmet belonged to, or how they died, which would indicate that it isn't his great-great-grandfather's, and thus he didn't serve in the Prussian military in World War I. One way of trying to make sense of this discrepancy is to conclude that perhaps Gregg's great-great-grandfather was an American soldier who brought the pickle helmet back with him as a trophy. This was a fairly common practice in just about every armed conflict. But still, this conflicts with the earlier dialogue about his great-great-grandfather surviving the shot to the head, so I'm inclined to think that the first conversation about the helmet is correct, and that he was indeed a Prussian soldier in World War I. If so, then I suspect that the second conversation about the helmet is simply a continuity error that the team failed to catch before release, or the Weird Autumn edition, for that matter, when the game's dialogue received several small but noticeable revisions. As for the helmet's political affiliation, Gregg is technically correct in saying that the Germans of World War I were not the Nazis, and they were not fascists. They were certainly nationalists, but that was a problem with almost every country in World War I. It's part of why the European powder keg exploded the way it did. That said, the Nazis made a point of embracing any and all symbols of German heritage that they thought might make them look strong and legitimate, which has as much to do with people thinking it's a fascist helmet as historical inaccuracy. Thus, it's probably not the best idea to wear one in public. It's sort of like showing up to a cosplay convention as certain characters or factions from Warhammer 40,000. A lot of people are going to get the wrong idea about you if you do it. Of course, in Gregg's world, his friends are far more important than his family. He's been fortunate enough to have some good ones. When he was in high school, he met two of his very best friends, Mae Borowski and Casey Hartley. Together, Gregg and these two cats got into all sorts of trouble around Possum Springs. They would do crimes, which in this context always means relatively minor offenses, like buying robots from shady characters at the abandoned food donkey, breaking into dilapidated cars to take their hardware, and stealing items of small value from local stores. We're never told how Gregg met Mae and Casey, but I like to think that they met because of their mischievous nature. Perhaps they got detention from the same teacher, who would certainly go on to regret the friendship they forged that day. Though we're not told much specifically about Gregg's bond with Casey, it's clear that they were very close. Gregg talks about him more than any of the other main characters do aside from Mae, and when the truth about what happened to him is exposed down the mines, he comes close to shooting his crossbow at the cult in an attempt to get some vengeance for his fallen friend. He would get his revenge eventually, albeit in a more indirect manner. I suspect that much of Gregg's stalwart admiration for Casey stems from the fact that when Mae left Possum Springs to attend college, Casey was the only person he could turn to for some carefree, spontaneous fun. That's a huge part of Gregg's identity, so it stands to reason that when Mae left, he clung to Casey ever more tightly, until he, too, was no longer around. Speaking of Mae, I'd imagine that their friendship in high school was similar to what we see in-game, full of spur-of-the-moment activities and general mischief. But something I find to be rather critical about their bond in those formative years, from a lore perspective, is the fact that Gregg was in the stands on the day of the killer incident, when Mae attacked Andy Cullen with a baseball bat during a softball game after experiencing an episode of disassociation. This actually tells us a great deal about the specifics of the killer incident itself, but all of that is best saved for a Lore in the Woods video that will cover that fateful day in detail. But on Gregg's end, it speaks volumes that he stuck by her despite what happened. No doubt there was pressure, both from his peers and his parents, to stay away from her. But he didn't, and when they discussed the killer incident during their heart-to-heart on the couch, his support for Mae is unflinching. He goes as far as to say that he was scared for her, not Andy, which says everything about how much he prioritizes her over and above everyone else. As important as Mae and Casey are in Gregg's life, no one has influenced him more than his boyfriend, Angus. Much like we don't know how Gregg became friends with Mae and Casey, we don't know how Gregg and Angus met either, nor do we know how long they've been dating. In-game dialogue makes it pretty clear that they've been dating since high school, but we're not given any specifics. It's also said that they're the only openly gay couple in Possum Springs, so I doubt that Possum Springs High School has a Rainbow Alliance, or a similar club that helps promote LGBTQIA rights, so they probably didn't meet there. Rather, I suspect that their relationship started shortly after Angus joined their garage band. At some point in high school, Gregg, Mae, and Casey formed a garage band that played pop-punk tunes at the old party barn in town. As anyone who's ever played in a band will tell you, it's great to have a tight, powerful instrumental foundation for your group. But if you don't have a good singer, you'll never appeal to a more casual audience or find places to play out. Unless you're a musician, the first thing you'll usually notice about a band is likely their singer. Thus, I wouldn't be surprised if Gregg met Angus when they brought him into the band, and their relationship developed from there. It's easy for me to imagine them practicing after school, going to the Click-Clack for pizza, and playing video games with other members of the band as their friendship slowly but surely evolved into a relationship. While we're on the topic of the band, I think it's likely that Gregg is the group's primary songwriter. We know that Mae didn't write any of the songs they play in game, at least not those they perform at the party barn. And back when he still had a Curious Cat page, Scott Benson clarified, despite rampant speculation, that Casey wasn't a writer, and thus wasn't responsible for the creation of Die Anywhere Else. As for B, she just operates the laptop. She didn't write any of the music, which leaves Gregg and Angus as the band's potential songwriters. Though Angus certainly wouldn't be the first mild-mannered individual to express himself through some grim pop-punk lyrics, I think the content of Die Anywhere Else, Weird Autumn, and Pumpkin Head Guy sound more like things Gregg would have written. Especially Die Anywhere Else, which perfectly summarizes Gregg's feelings towards Possum Springs and his desire to live his life like the surviving sheep that got away. When it comes to their personalities, Gregg and Angus couldn't be more different. Gregg is a free spirit and always down for spontaneous fun and mischief, while Angus is more down-to-earth, organized, and detail-oriented. But that's likely why they work together. Gregg seems to value the structure and predictability Angus brings to his life. I also think it's likely that they've bonded over their shared history of family trauma. As we all know, the abuse and neglect that Angus suffered at the hands of his mother and father is far worse than anything Gregg dealt with. But I'm sure that Gregg's experience with being sent away to his uncle's farm because his parents got sick of him helped him to empathize with Angus's tragic story, thus strengthening their bond. After they graduated high school, Gregg and Angus managed to escape their family situations by living together in an apartment in town center. It's not the best place. They have some strange neighbors and the intercom button doesn't work very well, but it is a home. A refuge from a town in which they don't feel welcome, and families that treat them poorly. A place to hang out with their friends and enjoy life together as an openly gay couple. And someday, hopefully, it will just be another place that they lived on the path to greater things. Because Gregg and Angus have a plan to save up enough money and move away to Bright Harbor. By all accounts, Bright Harbor is a younger, more progressive town, and there, they hope they'll be welcomed for their sexuality, rather than stand out the way they do in Possum Springs. They hope there will be more opportunities for them there, to get better jobs and forge happier lives. To help make the plan a reality, Gregg and Angus both work at stores in town. Gregg is a cashier at Snack Falcon, or the Lord of the Snack Falcon as he calls it. How Gregg is able to hold down this job is an interesting question. He leaves the Snack Falcon whenever Mae asks him to, despite being the only employee we ever see working in the store. Even B references this, and her ending to the game. The whole conversation around Gregg and his work habits reminds me of the bit about Barney Stinson and his job from How I Met Your Mother. In both cases, no one knows how they stay employed in light of their lackadaisical behavior. This is a huge part of what makes Mae's return to Possum Springs a fortunate thing for Gregg himself, but a source of strife for his relationship with Angus. Casey went missing in June 2017, which means by the time Mae returns in October, he'd been gone for 4 months. That's a long while, a whole quarter of the year that Gregg spent without a carefree friend to have spontaneous fun with. It's for this reason that he's so overjoyed when Mae walks into the Snack Falcon at the beginning of the game. He's not just happy to see her, he's happy that the lifestyle he grew up with can come back again. What follows if Mae chooses to hang out with Gregg is a nostalgia tour for the two of them. They do crimes, put together animatronic robots with the help of stolen car parts, and have knife fights out in the woods. But ultimately, this creates internal conflict for Gregg. Mae reminds him of who he used to be, but thanks to Angus's influence, he started to become someone different, someone more responsible and dependable. He vents about this in his third hangout, as he expresses his fear that he's a trash person and not good enough for Angus. We see the impact this tension has caused on their relationship on day 10, when he and Angus are at odds on the way to Donut Wolf. It's at the end of this hangout that the couple explains the plan to Mae, and Gregg, in a moment of impressive growth and self-awareness, admits that he needs to keep working on himself, that he needs to grow into the person Angus needs him to be if they're ever going to escape Possum Springs. If Mae spends the majority of her time with Gregg, he'll become a force to be reckoned with in the climax. He'll shoot Ide in the shoulder with his crossbow, threaten to fire it at the rest of the cult, and then protect Mae when the cult's most notorious member attacks her as they try to leave. Ide doesn't survive the struggle and brings the mineshaft crashing down around him. Though Gregg, Mae, and the others escape, the same can't be said for the cult. Gregg may have thrown down his crossbow to protect his friends, but he did get revenge for Casey after all. Night in the Woods ends before we find out if Gregg and Angus's plan to move to Bright Harbor was successful. While some might question Gregg's commitment to his boyfriend and their dream, I don't. Because if there's one thing that's clear about Gregg, is that he's going to keep on living life just like the sheep that escaped his uncle's farm. A free spirit, unburdened by the judgment of others in a town that confines him. A spontaneous soul who takes risks and attempts to lead those he cares about to greener pastures. And a devoted friend who's determined to die anywhere else. Thanks for watching. Huge thanks to my Night in the Woods collaborators Wolf.Godwin, Allan Naslund, and Jordi Jaen Moreno. Check out all three of these amazing artists, just follow the links down below in the description box. Special shout out to Shishibro Kenji, who drew the fan art for this month's closing section. To submit your fan art for next month's Night in the Woods video, head on over to our community Discord server and drop it in the fan art submissions channel. Big shout out to all my silver and gold tier YouTube channel members and Patreon subscribers, including James Pruitt, Little Caesar, Reed, Bethonian, Anna Novakova, Sean Bobby, Green, and Draco Woloski, who get early access to these videos thanks to donations of $5 to $10 a month. See you guys next time, and go birds!